Good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, which is called Debunking the Myth of Interoperability and the Next Generation of Faxing. It seems like for decades in healthcare, we've heard that interoperability is just around the corner, but it was just around the corner 30 years ago. So is it really just around the corner now? Arthur Young, CEO of Interbit Data, is here to talk about just that and what's keeping us from real interoperability. We want this to be a fun and interactive webinar, so we encourage you to participate in a few polls that we'll be springing on you throughout the session today. And by doing that, you'll learn something about the trends and how other healthcare organizations view interoperability and data transfers. And that said, don't worry if your dog is barking or if you're eating lunch, because all participants are muted and participant video is off and you are not able to see the other attendees in the webinar. But feel free to submit questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and we will be sure to answer those at the end of the presentation. We do have a lot to get through, so I will move things right along and introduce our presenter today. He's been heavily involved in healthcare technology for more than 30 years, and he knows this space very, very well, so we are delighted to welcome Interbit Data CEO Arthur Young. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you to everyone who's attending. We all appreciate your time, and hopefully this will be useful information. Let me first explain the controversial title, Debunking Interoperability. I mean, yeah, I know we've made a lot of steps, but if I can tell you, I started working at Meditech in 1984, and the first account that I visited was in Staten Island. And when I walked into the computer room, I was confronted by a floor-to-ceiling stack of Apple IIe computers from their experiment with a best-of-breed interoperability, where they had Apple II computers distributed through the hospital, which were going to transfer the messages or translate the messages from one best-of-breed admission system to another best-of-breed laboratory system, and all of that. And you know, to not surprise anybody, well, it didn't quite work. The concept was excellent, you know, that we're looking to exchange information. Unfortunately, the execution, the technology, and all of that wasn't there. But the expectation was, you know, within 5 years, we're going to be doing that. And that's going to be my recurring theme in the presentation, is it always seems like true interoperability is 5 years away. So let me start by asking you a question. This is our first poll question. What do you see as the biggest barrier to interoperability? Please answer, and we'll take a few seconds.
Yep, everybody on the call, feel free to submit your answer to the questions, and we'll review those results. We'll give you all a few seconds.
There are no penalties for a wrong answer either.
There are no wrong answers.
Well, that's true. I'm not sure there were any right answers, but yeah, as well.
We should give people a write-in option.
Yeah.
Okay, it looks like, technical know-how or ability is our leader, with lack of trust that it will work in second place, and then kind of a distant third is something else. So there you go. There you have it.
That's very interesting. And kind of telling, because, yeah, we've spent a lot of time on the technology, and those are the three categories that ONC has identified. is are the technical, financial, and trust barriers. Um, it's interesting, and I'll allude to it later. The technologies that we've developed, and yet we haven't been able to enhance. And I'll sow a seed of something that I'll talk about later, and that seed is that we also need to look at. I think that there's a difference between that electronic patient record as a permanent and historical document and the need for information right now in order to provide patient care. And that sometimes, time is that factor. What do we need to do? And it's not one or the other, but it can still be, we can still achieve that interoperability. Let me tell you also, I think it's actually 5 years ago that I attended a seminar at Harvard. That was when you could actually be face to face with people. Um, and what they were talking about was a wonderful idea, is taking the model of, the app store that Apple has, and without talking about restrictive barriers and costs, but the idea being that if the database could have all the right hooks, then you could write whatever application you want or need, and you could be feeding both from and to a common database. And it's a wonderful and exciting idea, because then you could remove a lot of the restrictions and not have to convince one physician or another physician, to get to use this application. You could basically allow people to use whatever application they want, as long as there was that common type of database. And I know Apple has done some work trying to achieve something like that, but it's a wonderful idea. It presents a lot of barriers, and like so many times, the technical barriers uh, um, include, what you're probably familiar with, which is that idea of semantic interoperability, because um, it's easy to say date of birth is date of birth and convey that information. But when I say a CBC, a CBC is a panel of tests, and a CBC at one hospital may not be the same as a CBC at another hospital. And again, that's a simple example of things that don't match. I mean, the more complex is the results that might be reported by physicians or whatever, and it gets very complicated. So it's a technical barrier, but it's a standardization barrier even more. Now, as I say, I know I'm talking about the lack of interoperability, but if you look here, this came from the ONC, and this is 2013. You know, only 40% of hospitals surveyed had the ability to electronically communicate with or to send PHI to outside sources. I mean, this is a historical relic, because let's face it, we have lots of ways of doing that, and especially for standardized data, it works pretty well. However, now we look at 2019 and, also from the ONC, you know, patients are reporting 32% of the time there has been some barrier to timely access of information, whether it's meant that a test has to be redone, or they have to hand carry information like that X-ray or whatever. So that's a third of the time they're still not having that timely integration of information, and that's you know ultimately that's the important point, is the timeliness and the comprehensiveness of that information. Um, and in fact, being the smart person that I am, I put timeliness as the number one barrier. Um, you know, um, the attempts to feed information between systems, and all of that, one of the challenges has been timeliness. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is identifying the patient. I mean, in the US at least, there is no usable unique patient identifier. And so there are many, many cycles of processing power and um, time spent trying to match that John Smith is John Smith. And it's interesting. I mean, this makes me think of the time that my family went to Hawaii, and my wife decided not to bring any ID with her, and uh, the people, the people in Homeland Security were actually able to gather all of this other information, like uh, they were able to ask us about who our neighbors were and other types of information. It was very interesting to be able to validate that she was in fact who she said she was. So that information is there. It's just, how do you get it? And that there's not a simple way, like if there was a single patient ID. And in Canada they do typically have an insurance ID, which should be unique to the individual and or family. um, you know the challenge also is aligning on a standard. Now, the CCD document has been really useful because it does um, organize information in a common standard. However, um, it's not always usable in other circumstances. It's usable for specific transmission of information, but there are other challenges to other information that may want to be transferred that doesn't fit conveniently into that document. Um, you know, uh, the usability aspects, we're always running this challenge between security and access. Okay, so we want to ensure the confidentiality of that PHI, and yet we need to balance that off with the usability factor. That means that the clinician shouldn't have to authenticate themselves through each step. However, on the one hand, we're trying to expand the access to the care team, on a general continuum, but at the same time, we have to be careful about that, um, confidentiality. And so how do we uh, put, we're constantly running a balancing act. And again, I bring up the issue of timeliness because it's timeliness that is the difference between I can assemble a comprehensive record, but I need to have the information to provide care now. So sometimes, and ultimately, I can create that comprehensive record, but maybe not always in time to, or not always meeting the timely requirements of the clinician. But you see that there's lots of uh, barriers and challenges. Financial barriers, I think interoperability and access to information uh, has these days, they're operational incentives, but they're not necessarily financial incentives. And there's always a risk of penalties by, you know, accidentally display, PHI incidents and HIPAA violations and all of that. Um, the workload required in some of these steps of ensuring the interoperability. It falls again on staff who are already overworked. The challenges that are going on in terms of consolidation, as I say, the care networks, um, that's very important, and it leads to prioritization of what can we do now. Let's get success here before we move further. To the extent, again, we've already made some of that compromise of um, ensuring electronic capture of information, and to some extent workload has suffered. The efficiencies that are promised from the electronic age have not always been realized yet, hopefully. There is also a financial barrier in terms of if you're trying to interoperate with other systems, both systems need to make a financial investment to allow that to happen, because communications is not unilateral. It does require two parties, and it means, again, it's not just me. I can send you information, but if you can't use it, it's really no good. You need to make that investment as well. So, um, again, trust barriers. Um, there have been many recommendations made. There are certain standards, but it's really, um, uh, if you try to do something and you're using your best efforts, it's still, you can still be penalized because somebody doesn't agree with you. And so it's hard. When a new billing scheme comes in, there are very specific specifications that everybody writes to. But in terms of interoperability between systems, there are many schemes. There is not one scheme. And there is even the suggestion that, my patients are an asset. And certainly in this country, that patient record doesn't really belong to the patient, it belongs to the entity. And notwithstanding the upcoming requirements to share that information, it's still a fact that Um, if the patient goes from hospital A to hospital B, the trusted way of communicating between those hospitals is from hospital to hospital. It's not the patient is not a trusted mechanism. They can have their own electronic record and share it with another entity. That's not typically considered a real trust. And this is where um, well, the next slide will talk about solutions, but um, you know, the the question of that complexity. Who has access to what portion of the record? Do all clinicians have access to the psychiatric profile? Do um, you know? Well, there's many complexities as we want to create that care continuum where all the um, professionals or all the parties can be working, uh, providing care for that patient. There is an ever increasing complexity of security and access to that record and accountability as well. So it becomes a matrix and a very complicated um, uh, scenario. So trust that the information is correct, but also that it is provided on a timely basis. Um, I'll mention again, my brother-in-law went to have a procedure done at Mass Eye and Ear, and his physician was at Mass General. And for those of you not familiar, there's actually a bridge between the two buildings of Mass General and Mass Eye and Ear, but he had to have the same lab tests done because they didn't have that interoperability set up that would allow the transmission of the lab tests from basically next door. Um, and even going back further, I can tell you, uh, I started covering Ontario for Meditech in about 1988 or 1989. And at that time in Ontario, there was a, a project to eliminate redundant lab tests by consolidating that information and creating a common place to store and transmit that information. So that was 1988. I think they may have achieved most of that maybe 3 years ago or so. So that's 2018. That's 30 years. Um, and again, there are many fewer barriers there since it's all, well, since it is a patient record in Canada and because, there is a single payer system, which is, the government. So it's interesting, legal and business incentives. So what are the tools that we have? And these are the tools. We talked about the technical challenges. Well, we got lots of tools. We've had HL7 for quite a while, Fire, which is again an iteration of or a standardization, of the HL7 chain, which is doing a lot to improve, but it still does not present a universal and timely uh, the ability to exchange data on a timely basis universally because all the systems need to be set up. And that means as we look at, the extended care um, continuum, it means individual clinicians as well as group practices, as well as hospitals, as well as extended care facilities, all of that needing to be able to interpret that same information. Blockchain, when we were talking about the matrix of security, um, that's where blockchain comes in. And, you know, I honestly don't necessarily understand the bits and bytes of blockchain, and subsequently have not invested in digital currency, although I regret that. But blockchain provides a mechanism where you can segregate access of information based on different identities and all of that. And you can set up those matrices, although again, it calls for some standardization and common language. And I have not really seen in practice the application of blockchain, although it's an exciting technology. Direct messaging, another sort of exciting technology, again, promoted by ONC as a trusted network, and so it overcomes one of those elements of trust, because the only people who can communicate on that direct network are known entities and trusted entities. So if I'm sending you a message using direct, then you can trust that it comes from an authoritative source. Excuse me. And that's great, except again, there are not necessarily standards to what that content is, and where those standards exist, they sort of exclude other information, like I've suggested, using direct to be able to communicate information to insurance companies, who are doing audits and things like that. But there's no mechanism, there's no messages that you can use in direct. So it's great to have that network, but it's not general purpose, and it hasn't reached a tipping point. And the tipping point is, with a lot of these secure message networks, people aren't sure whether the physicians are always going to be checking. And if they're not always checking, you can't guarantee that there's going to be a timely exchange of information. And what's frequently more important than being able to say, yes, I sent it, is being able to be assured that they've received it and that they can take action on the information. And until it's reached a tipping point. Now, email used to be great in terms of being able to send something and people got it. Well, it was so great at that it's now totally overwhelmed. And I myself no longer trust when I send an email that somebody has read it, because it's been filtered out or, spammed, or, I mean, it's, you sort of want to make a phone call to find out if somebody got an email, because people are just, the system is overwhelmed, and there hasn't been a um, a good way to identify and prioritize that type of exchange, which then comes down to fax. And fax is here in the tools, and you may or may not believe that it belongs there, but in fact, it is still the most ubiquitous tool to exchange information. Um, you know, you it's relatively easy. People have a fax number and you can send them a fax, and fax machines have ways of telling people that they got something, whether it's the paper appearing in the feeder or, a notification, um, whatever. They're all ways that the fax becomes sort of the lowest common denominator if I want to send information to somebody else. You've probably seen this cartoon before. Um, and it is, in fact, what's happened a lot. You know, when people have recognized the number of competing standards there are, so let's create a universal standard. And so you start out with 14 competing standards, you create a universal standard, and now you have 15 competing standards. And unfortunately, that seems to be the way it goes. So now, again, an interactive question for you guys. Um, you know, who actually created the ONC for health information technology, healthcare sector? Uh, let's give you 1 minute to respond to the question, and um, and
Okay.
then we will. Oh, Claire.
I'm happy to sing the Jeopardy song if you need me to. I'm not actually going to do that.
No, I just want to, in the interest of time, I just want to make sure we don't spend too much time. I think people can make their choice quickly.
They can, and they have actually. We already see some results rolling in, so that's great.
Okay.
The most popular response so far is President George W. Bush, and we've got President Obama in second place, and no votes for Biden or Trump. So top two choices, or top two answers so far being George
Well,
Bush
and
and
not to be
Obama.
political, but I'd say Biden hasn't had a chance to do anything, and Trump didn't. But uh,
So it looks
um,
like our respondents are doing well.
so what is the answer anyway? Do we know?
What is the answer? Let's see. Oh, the answer is George W. Bush
Yeah, interesting.
in 2004.
Okay. Well, I actually didn't know that. I would have thought
It's
Obama.
educational for all of us today.
Yeah. So let's talk about the future of fax. And if you see this strange machine on the right of the slide is actually a depiction of the first fax machine, which actually dates back to around 1830, believe it or not, because it was connected into the telegraph network. So it didn't even require telephony. It's just been advanced over time, and it could recreate copies of information from one side to the other. But anyway, so what's the future of fax? And again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just talk about first, analog modems are going away. The analog infrastructure in telecommunications is going away. And that means that, analog modems are being replaced by digital technology like fax over IP. And I think that's certainly a benefit in terms of reliability, standardization, and transportability, because if you no longer have a modem, then I can have, on any desktop, I can have that faxing. Cloud fax, to my mind, cloud fax is simply another way of eliminating the modem, and it really doesn't differ substantially. It's great for individuals, to be able to have a fax number without having a fax machine, but the pricing matrix that is created makes it less than ideal for large volume users, because usually it's charged by the page or minute. Encrypted transport, I mean, because there's always a concern about that data moving through the network. And yes, there is more and more ability to encrypt information as it transits certain portions of the network to maintain security, but ultimately it has to be decrypted sometime before it ends up on a piece of paper, or else all you get on that piece of paper is gobbledygook. So, but I think that we are doing a better job of securing the end to end. The real future, I think, has to do with OCR and converting those messages, or not necessarily entirely to OCR, because there's still gaps in 100% reliability, but using the information within that document in order to move a workflow forward. So rather than having multiple people handling a piece of paper, you can route that piece of paper or that fax to the appropriate destination, and that will ultimately continue to improve that workflow associated with faxing. So just to give you a quick example of what one of our customers had seen. The hospital's challenge. This was a particular customer who critical access hospital in a rural catchment area, covering a large geography. And what they were able to do with basically electronic fax and fax over IP and all of that is to create that portable office that the orthopod could, go to some office space that was provided to them. And basically, because of all the electronic tools they had, they could operate just as if they were in their own office and exchange information, receive information, and bring the care to the patient, which is ultimately one of the things that we're trying to accomplish. That if when you're trying to expand your catchment area, it doesn't always make sense. It doesn't make financial sense or practical sense to create physical locations. So utilize a location within another practitioner's space or whatever. And so, utilizing faxing and all of that, they're able to, create those outposts, shall we say. And really that does lead to what our contention is. Our contention is that the true definition of interoperability is really, it's not a set of standards, it's the ability to deliver the information to the recipient in a way that they're prepared to utilize it. And that's the key. And we can talk to you more about our products, but basically our NetDelivery, provides a way to match the data and the data format with the recipient and the type of message. So lab results may go out on a fax or an email, but a critical result maybe goes as a secure text to the individual clinician. But again, the the issue, yes, there are lots of standards, but the issue is for timely um, delivery. It's how can the person who needs the information get it in a way that they're going to be able to utilize it, and that's really where our net delivery products excel. So here's another question for you, just again for your own education. What methods do hospitals or health systems use most frequently to communicate information? We're talking about all of these little, um, all of these different mechanisms. And so, what's the number one? And I'm going to give away uh, the answer, I think. Um, Claire, could we
Yeah, absolutely. So
we
we're be sure to drop your answer there in the
yep,
poll. And it looks like right now leading is secure message. We also have a couple answers for phone and fax.
yep. Well, according to the ONC, or according to the latest statistics, I don't think this was actually ONC because they didn't really give us latest statistics. But the most frequent way to communicate patient information is just picking up a phone and calling the clinician. In fact, the next most utilized method was email. And again, I'm hoping or assuming that it's secure email, but it just was mentioned as email. The third most frequently utilized mechanism was fax. Um, Maybe surprisingly, the fourth was secure message. Now, again, this can cover a lot of ground, but it's um, this is what was documented. Whoops, and yeah, the fifth was the EHR. That information there, that this was the initial communication of this information was actually in the EHR. And again, it's not um, well, it is a work in progress. And so interoperability is important. Interoperability is a goal. Interoperability is possible in terms of assembling the information, but we still have a challenge with timely exchange of information. Um, I skipped over questions. So please um, open the floor for questions.
Right. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A button on your screen. We are probably only going to have time for maybe one or two, so go ahead and send those in if you have them. And it looks like we do have our first question. First question is, how do you explain the fax machine's endurance when the technology has disappeared from virtually every other industry?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Basically, it is such a ubiquitous item. It is exempt from HIPAA still, because it's not considered electronic. So that certainly helped to prolong it. But it's a way to exchange a dense amount of information in a way that is readily received. And really, um, other things are more challenging. So it's there and it's going to be there for a while because it serves that need. There is no standardization in terms of capabilities to accept a lot of the other methodologies. So it remains a ubiquitous delivery source.
Okay, great. And we are just about at time, but we do have one more question if we can get to this one quickly enough. I think we can. Do you see the fax machine going away in healthcare anytime soon?
Uh, I don't. I mean, um, yeah, it's human nature, and it's not simply a matter of old practice versus new practice. I think that the fax machine will be enhanced through, being able to become or to instigate more workflow out of it. But until we reach a tipping point and um, another ubiquitous method of communicating, until, for instance, email can be both secured and better authenticated so that I have better ways of filtering important from unimportant, fax machines. Um, they remain there, and we will continue to support the continuum of delivery methods in order to ensure that the information that's transmitted will be uh, will be able to be utilized by that recipient, and that's the important thing.
Fantastic. All right, thanks so much, Arthur. Unfortunately, we are just about at our allotted time for today. In fact, we're a couple minutes over. So if we didn't get to your question, we do apologize. You're always welcome to reach out to us. We have our contact information up there on the screen for you. And, we hope that we were able to provide you with some useful takeaways and that you enjoyed our presentation today. If you did enjoy this webinar, you might also enjoy some of the blogs and white papers that we have available at interbitdata.com under the resources menu. And be sure to check back often for additional webinar events. This event has been sponsored by Interbit Data, so check us out anytime. Thanks so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.